So were the leaders of the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the other leaders of the United States, were just vicious Jew haters. And they wanted the Jews to be killed. Simple, very simple. They wanted the Jews to be murdered. They certainly didn't want the Jews to survive and then come to America or England. That they certainly didn't want. And they didn't want a Jewish state. And they hated Jews in general. So for all those reasons, they were happy to see, the one thing they were happy about in the war was the fact that Hitler and the Germans, Yimach Shmam V'Zichram, were murdering millions of Jewish men, women, and children. They were happy about that. They wanted that to happen. Now, when the head of the revisionist Zionist movement, the head of the right-wing Jews, the revisionist Zionist movement, the Jabotinsky Jews, told Joel Brandt, your fellow Jewish agency people, the Chaim Weizmann and the people in the Jewish agency, and David Ben-Gurion and the other leaders of the Jewish community in Israel, they're going to hand you over to the British. The British are going to arrest you and put you in prison to shut you up and prevent you from publicizing this proposed deal, because they want the Jews to die. The head of the Jewish agency and these other groups are going to hand you over to the British. So Joel Brandt said, why would they do that? We could save millions of Jews. Why wouldn't they want to save millions of Jews? And the head of the revisionists said they don't want to save. These Jewish traitors also don't want these Jews to survive. Because if these religious, nationalistic Jews from Poland and Hungary and these other places that are being murdered by the Germans survive, they're not going to vote for socialist, Marxist, traitor leaders like David Ben-Gurion. They're not going to support degenerate, elitist, arrogant, egotistical, evil, self-hating scum like Chaim Weizmann. They're not going to support leftist scum like this. And so they knew that they wouldn't become the rulers of the new Jewish state if millions of these Jews from Eastern Europe survived. They knew, especially after the experiences of the Holocaust, that would make them even more Jewish, even more militant, even more determined to have right-wing Jewish leaders there after what they suffered in the Holocaust, after all they saw happen to the Jewish people. They wouldn't be in the mood to talk about peace with all of our enemies, or assimilation or socialism or the workers of the world. They wouldn't be in the mood for that. After they saw their own families and their own people being murdered in the most brutal savagery in history by National Socialists, because that's what Nazism is. Nazism is National Socialism. The Nazi Party. The term Nazi is the German acronym for National Socialist. After seeing that, these same Jews who were victims of National Socialism are going to support socialists like David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann in Israel? They knew that they wouldn't be able to do it. And so they didn't want the Jews saved either. And they said so openly. They said so openly. They said these Jews are not right for the land of Israel. They have to stay in Europe and accept their fate, Chaim Weizmann wrote in the fall 1937 edition of the Zionist Affairs magazine. It was called Zionist Affairs, a British left-wing, self-hating Jewish magazine. He said, millions of Jews in Europe are dust on the wheels of history. They must accept their fate. And they're just dust that has to be blown away, he said. We don't want them flooding into Tel Aviv. We don't want them flooding into Tel Aviv, turning our Tel Aviv into a low-grade ghetto. That was the quote in the Zionist Affairs magazine. He said that saving the Jews in the Holocaust would mean turning our Tel Aviv into a low-grade ghetto. In other words, the Jews would be too religious, too nationalistic, too Jewish. We don't want Jewish Jews. We want assimilated, self-hating scum like us, elitist, self-hating, anti-Torah scum. That's what Chaim Weizmann wanted. That's what David Ben-Gurion wanted. That's what they all wanted. And so, surely enough, when Joel Brandt, he didn't believe it. He said, there's no way that Jewish leaders would do this to millions of Jews in Europe. There's no way. I don't believe it. I don't believe they would do something like this. They could save millions of their brothers and sisters that are being burned and gassed and tortured to death, and they wouldn't grab the opportunity. He said, I don't believe it. I don't believe that's true. I refuse to believe it. And so he got on the train, and on his way to Israel in Damascus, he was stopped by the British police who were informed by the Jewish agency that he was on the train. Only the Jewish agency knew he was, only the Jewish agency knew that he was traveling on that train. So they were the only ones who could have informed on him. And surely enough, the British police, getting the tip from the Jewish agency, stopped him and arrested him. They took him into custody and held him for weeks, even though he didn't commit any crime, but they held him for so-called investigations and other things, and just held him for weeks. Meanwhile, every day that he was being held, 12,000 more Jewish men, women, and children were being murdered in the German Nazi gas chambers. Finally, after a number of weeks, the British finally released him. And when they released him, guess what happened? He went to the land of Israel, and in Jerusalem, the Jewish agency arrested him and held him. They held him up and refused to let him leave for months. The Jewish agency actually held him and refused to let him go because they didn't want him to let the word out that there was a serious plan to save the Jews. Can you believe this? Here's someone who came with a plan where they could have saved at least 1 million Jews and maybe as many as 3 million. Between 1 and 3 million, at least 1 million, that's for sure. Easily, the Jews could easily have been saved. And instead of grabbing the plan and immediately, they put the guy, they first snitched on him and handed him over to the British. And then when the British let him go after a few weeks, they grabbed him and arrested him and held him themselves because he wanted to save the Jews in Europe that were being murdered. And in fact, there's documentation of David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann and others holding a meeting where they formally and officially decided to reject Eichmann's proposal to save the Jews. They didn't want to save the Jews. Now, 6 million Jews, over 6 million Jews were murdered because of traitor leaders like this. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, was a traitor whose hand is soaking with the blood of 6 million Jews. Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, a traitor whose hand is dripping with the blood of 6 million innocent Jews. This is all the major Jewish establishment organizations in America, the UJA. Today they call themselves the United Jewish Communities, or whatever they call them. Whatever they call themselves, they should die of cancer, those animals. They refused to do anything and sabotaged efforts to save the 6 million Jews. The Anti-Defamation League, B'nai B'rith, the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, Hadassah, all of them were guilty. All of them were part of a conspiracy to sabotage any rescue efforts to save 6 million Jews. The American Jewish leaders didn't want to do it because if the Jews had been saved, then all the anti-Semites would have said, we went to war in World War II just to save the Jews. That was their reasoning. That was their reasoning. That's what Roosevelt, Yimach Shmo, told Stephen Wise, who was the self-hating leader of the American Jewish Congress. And so he used to call him Little Stevie, Roosevelt. He used to tease him and call him Little Stevie. I mean, and make anti-Semitic remarks. He was such a... Roosevelt was a Nazi. Anyway, the Holocaust took place. The war ended. And after that, Joel Brandt went to Israel. Now, he should have... Ordinarily, he would have gotten a very high-paying position. He would have been one of the major leaders of Israel. He was the head of the Jewish agency, their main representative in Hungary. That's a major position. So he should have easily gotten the best employment, the best everything. Instead, he couldn't find any work. They deliberately locked him out and made sure that he would remain desperate and unemployed. And they persecuted him in Israel, in the early days of Israel. All because he had wanted to save the Jews during the Holocaust, and all because he was telling people about what happened. And so finally, they wanted to shut him up because he had written memoirs and he had gotten together documentation. He had a lot of documentation to prove that everything he was saying was true. And so they decided they have to silence him because it wasn't, after what the trauma of the Holocaust, for the Jewish people to know the truth about what their evil, self-hating Jewish leaders did to them.